What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Some people are disappointed tonight. They thought I was going to talk about the Dead Sea Squirrels. That's something entirely different and unfortunate, very, very unfortunate. No, the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is a fascinating area of study. Before I go any further, I just want to mention a few really helpful resources that I recommend for this kind of study. James Vanderkam and Peter Flint, what I think is the finest introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's published by Harper San Francisco. Highly recommend it. There are also other resources that I'd recommend. Here is a series edited by James H. Charlesworth, The Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is just a first volume of a 3-volume set. In addition to that, there's a smaller book, maybe a bit more accessible, edited by John Collins and Craig Evans, Christian Beginnings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fascinating. If you're doing any real scholarly research on the Dead Sea Scrolls, or if you're looking for a helpful resource for a paper, the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls, can't recommend that highly enough. This is 2 volumes. I just brought 1 volume. And there are all kinds of specialized studies. One of my favorites is this by Joseph Angel, Otherworldly and Eschatological Priesthood in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Lots of studies like this. And my favorite translation, it's the one I'll be using mostly here, is by Martinez and Tig Shalar, the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. And you can get this in 2 volumes with the Hebrew on one side and the English on the other. Or you can just get a 1 volume that just has the English. And if you really aren't doing this in a graduate program, you probably are fine with just the English translation, right? But the Dead Sea Scrolls are available now. They've been published. People can read them. What's going on with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Let's get into this just a little bit here. Okay, so the Dead Sea Scrolls obviously found in, around the Dead Sea. So here's a map. You can get a basic sense of the part of the world we're looking at. Okay, so you can see Iraq. You can see what we describe as the Promised Land. Here's Israel over here. And if we look at this from, a bird's eye perspective, we see Jordan. We see Syria up there. There's Iraq, right? And if we zoom in a little bit more, we'll see, okay, here is map of Israel, and basically in Israel you have a couple of bodies of water that are really significant. Up at the top you have the Sea of Galilee way up there, and down here there's the Dead Sea. Here's where Jerusalem is. All right, Galilee is further up north. If you wanted to think about this in Jesus' day, right, so if you're familiar with the New Testament, Galilee is way up there. You see the Sea of Galilee way up there. You see Cana, Nazareth way up at the top. And then as you move south, you get to Samaria. This is, of course, the location of the Samaritans. And then you move down further. Here's Judea. Down here is Jerusalem. And over here is the Dead Sea. And Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, is right over here at the northern part of this famous body of water. A little bit closer, you see it. Here's Jerusalem, Bethlehem. And here is where Khirbet Qumran is. There's an archaeological site I'll talk about in a minute. They found several caves containing the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here's the sea, and here you can see where these various caves are. There's what used to be, looks like a fortress or a religious community's home. Some people call it a monastery. Right, you can see that right over here. And there are, as we'll see, 11 caves where they found this amazing discovery. All right, so what happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay, so there were 3 Bedouin shepherds, and they were out watching their flock, I guess, over by the Dead Sea. And this was in 1947. It might have been late 1946. Chronology here is a little bit rough. And they were around the northwest side of the Dead Sea. And one of these 3 Bedouin shepherds, they were cousins, one of them liked to explore these caves that were around the Dead Sea. and they're pretty difficult to access. But what they would do is this one guy in particular used to like to go and look around. He was hoping to find some treasure, right? Hoping to find some gold, something valuable. And so one day, he was walking along with his 2 other companions, and he threw a rock, as he used to do, into one of these caves, and they heard something shatter. And so the next day, early in the morning, one of the cousins got up before the others did, and it might have been because he was hoping to get there first and find any gold before the others found out about it. He went up there. They were a little upset with him, as you can imagine. He went up there and looked around. And so what did he find? Well, he found, did I say a day later? It was 2 days later he went there in the morning. And he heard something shatter, and he found these jars, okay? And here are the caves, so you can see, I mean, it's not the easiest place to get to, all right? And here are some of the jars that he found. He went in there, and he was shocked to discover about 10 jars, and inside some of them were scrolls wrapped with linen. All right, so what is this? Well, he wasn't really sure. Later on, we find out what they were. One of them contained the scroll of Isaiah. One of the most amazing finds actually in Qumran is the complete scroll of Isaiah. Found other things too, other documents. And so they brought it back. They brought these scrolls back. He eventually told his friends, and they found out, like I said, they were a little upset that he went there without them. And they brought these back, and they didn't really know what they had on them. They really didn't recognize how significant it was. And so they actually hung them on a pole, leaving them out exposed to the elements for a while. They didn't even know how important what they found would be. And they eventually took them, I'm summarizing the story, but eventually they found their way to an antiquities dealer. And the antiquities dealer opened them up, and he wasn't really sure what they found. I think some people originally thought, well, maybe these were scrolls stolen from a synagogue. Oh, that wouldn't be good, right? Now remember, in 1947, it was right after World War II, and right around this time, right at the end of it, this time, what we have is a divided Jerusalem. Very controversial, very heated in this part of the world, right? And lots of controversy over whether or not Israel will be a sovereign state. Those kinds of issues are big. And you have the British mandate, and the Holy Land is divided up into different areas. Anyway, so eventually they take the scrolls and they get to this guy named Eleazar Lipa Sukenik. And he was professor at Hebrew University. And what happens is he's taken to this place in Jerusalem. The city has been divided up. And through a partition, through like a fence, he looks over and they show him what they have. And he's looking at this and he's thinking to himself, oh my goodness, this looks really significant. Now, of course, Jerusalem is sort of dangerous at this time. So lots of different things happen. Some of the scrolls end up at a monastery. And the Christians there at the monastery they're not really sure what they found. They start reaching out to scholars to have them look at what they've discovered. And they act like, oh, well, these have been in our library for years. We're just wondering what these are. Eventually, they disclose that they just discovered these. These were just brought to them. And it's quite a dramatic story. There's a famous scholar named John Trevor. And he is brought in very early on to look at these scrolls and analyze them. He's convinced these are extremely significant. And in fact, it's kind of debated who owns them at this point. There's lots of problems with, the antiquities dealer, and which ones come from the monastery. Anyway, he goes to the place where they're at, and he gets his camera, and he takes all kinds of pictures of these scrolls. He just happens to be a professional photographer as well as a scholar. And it's really fortuitous that he did that, because some of the scrolls ended up damaged, and some of the scrolls ended up, they lost track of some of the scrolls become damaged in such a way that now scholars go back to those original photographs to see what was on them. Anyway, it was amazing that he thought to do that. And so they take the scrolls, eventually they smuggle them out of Jerusalem, which causes quite a controversy, you can imagine. And they go on and they begin to look around, and they excavate the area, and they find 11 more caves of scrolls. Now, you got to remember that these scrolls are made out of papyrus. They don't last, they're not really meant to last. It's sort of a biodegradable material. And so as they're unscrolling some of these things, they're disappearing, turning into dust. Right? Some of the scrolls are, broken up, and they piece them together and figure out which ones go together. Look how small some of these are. They, with the utmost care, had to open them up, look at them. Some of them are cut off at the bottom, like you can see in this picture. Some of them have holes in them, right? This requires an enormous amount of work among scholars. You can see they have holes in some of these fragments. Some of them are just all, like a big jigsaw puzzle. And scholars had to figure out, all right, which piece goes where, and it became a massive undertaking. I mean, you owe a huge debt of gratitude to the scholars who put them all together. And by the way, at the time, there was a lot of work that needed to be done, not just in order to piece them together and figure out what was there, but they also needed to solve ownership problems. And there were all sorts of issues, political issues. So because of this, sensationalistic stories started to come out. Oh, you know what they found? They found documents that say that Jesus really wasn't the person that we read about in the Bible. All kinds of crazy books came out with crazy stories, and really wasn't until the 1990s, I think, that the last of the Dead Sea Scrolls were finally able to be analyzed and translated and published. And there were people who were making the case that because the Vatican was involved, that the Vatican was trying to suppress the truth from coming out because this would destroy Christianity for all time. Of course, that's all bunk. Nobody believes that is what happened, of course. Now, here is some of the work that they did with photographs, and now with digital photography, they can see things. They can see where the ink was that you can't see to the naked eye. So amazing scholarship and science coming together. So what are these scrolls? Well, literally hundreds of manuscripts. Now, like I said, it depends how you count them. If they kind of got torn in two, do you count it as one or two? So you'll see different numbers, anywhere from 350 manuscripts to 931 manuscripts. But they were found in the 11 different caves at Qumran. And now, and they date back to a very ancient time, these scrolls can be broadly categorized in two buckets. You've got biblical texts, scrolls of the biblical books, and you've got non-biblical books, right? So books that are written by ancient Jews, for example, imagining what it'll be like when the Messiah comes. Those are some really fascinating texts. And scholars date these going all the way back to the 2nd or 3rd century BC. Amazing. Now that's something else, because while we have some copies of the biblical books from the 300s or 400s, our full complete manuscript of the Old Testament, our largest complete manuscript of the Old Testament, dates to 1008 AD. Okay? So we don't have the original book of 1 Corinthians, right? The original letter that Paul wrote. Right? That's also true of the Old Testament books. We don't have the original book written by various prophets, right? Or Psalms that go back all the way into antiquity to the people that the Psalms are attributed to. We have a copy of 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 a copy, right? We have lots of copies. And so we don't have the originals, we don't have the original autographs. And so there are many people who are concerned, well, how do we know that our book of Isaiah today was copied right over all of these years? What if the book of Isaiah in Jesus' day just looked radically different than our day? The book of Isaiah that we read today. Well, this is amazing. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found copies of the biblical books that go all the way back to the time of Jesus. Right? And in some instances, like Isaiah, they found the entire book of Isaiah. Right? Amazing. And we can compare it to what we have in the Bible today. There are, some differences, but by and large, it's the same book. A lot of them are slightly different words or, a phrase missing here or there. What does this tell us? What do the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us? Well, some amazing things come to light with the Dead Sea Scrolls. First off, one of the things we see is that there was really no official Bible in Jesus' day. Biblical books are found alongside non-biblical books, which is really remarkable. They didn't really have that issue settled in the first century. And if you've taken any of my courses in the New Testament, there were different groups in Jesus' day, right? The Sadducees, the Pharisees. The Pharisees recognized all these various books, like the prophets, like Isaiah, Jeremiah. The Sadducees, they only believed in the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? So you have different debates in the first century about which books should be accepted as scripture. And so in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see some of this depicted. Now, what happened there? We lost something. Okay, so in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see this, right? That the biblical books are right alongside the non-biblical books. So something else that we might point out, and that is, as they began to excavate the Dead Sea Scrolls, they became convinced that the Dead Sea Scrolls should be linked to this sort of these ruins that are found right next to the Dead Sea. And scholars refer to it as a Jewish monastery. Right? And now virtually all scholars believe that there's a connection between this set of ruins, this monastery, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's one scholar who disputes that, Norman Galb, but nobody takes him seriously anymore, so we're not going to talk about him. Okay? But you see here in these pictures some of the pictures of this site. And what's remarkable about this site is how much it looks like the kinds of things that we read about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, who was it that lived at the site? Here's a kind of reconstruction of what this site would look like. There's a big tower over here, and there are cisterns, and there are baths, there are ritual washing pools called mikvah, and all kinds of interesting things here in the city. I don't have time. I'm trying not to go too long here, but all sorts of interesting things. The tower is probably evidence that at one point this was like a military fortress, and then it was repurposed over a period of time for different things. But by the first century, it seems that there was a community that lived there. Here is a sort of reconstruction of what it might have looked like. Here's another artist depiction of what it might have looked like. So you go back to the first century and you see all sorts of, you go back to the site and you see all sorts of things that link the site to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, for example, we find these jars, these pots that are identical to what we find with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Identical pottery. Or we find in this community, in these ruins, we found 2 massive ink wells. What do you do with an ink well? Right? Copy documents. Right? So can it be a coincidence that they found this huge library of scrolls right next to this place with these massive ink wells? Probably not a coincidence, right? I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of the desert. It's not like there are a lot of people living out there, right? So this is another reason why scholars make the connection. But again, the Dead Sea Scrolls describe a communal life of this group of people that's amazingly consistent with what we find in these ruins. Like, for example, those mikvah, we find these ritual bathing pools that are very important in the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the way, here is a picture of one of those bathing pools, right? They go in there and they would cleanse themselves of impurity. We also have some interesting coins that are found, and that helps date things. I'll just show you one cool coin. I like this. So as Catholics, we have a book in our Bible called First and Second. We have two books, First and Second Maccabees. Okay? And in First and Second Maccabees, the big baddie is who? Does anybody know who the big bad guy is that the Maccabees revolt against? Yeah. The Greeks. That's right. What's the Greek figure who causes them so much trouble? Anybody remember? Anybody remember? His name is Antiochus. Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifest. All right. Well, we're having more problems here. Okay, so Antiochus was this major persecutor of the Jews. He wanted to assert Greek culture in the land of Israel. If you look here, here's a coin, and it's got Antiochus on it. And if you look, you can see the A and the N and the T right along the side. This is the guy, right, that we actually read about in 1st, 2nd Maccabees. Fascinating, just really interesting. So who lived at this site? Right? Who would have lived in this community? Well, as I mentioned before, we know Judaism in the 1st century isn't monolithic. We know that there are different kinds of Jews. There are Pharisees, there are Sadducees. There's another group of Jews that we actually never read about in the New Testament, but we know about from other ancient sources, and they were called the Essenes. Josephus, who's a 1st century Jewish historian, writes about the Essenes. He says, "For there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews, the followers of the first of whom are the Pharisees, of the second, the Sadducees, and the third sect, who pretends to be a severe discipline," they have severe practices, "are the Essenes. These last are Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. These Essenes reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence." That means they're celibate. They don't get married. They remain celibate. And he goes on to say, "And the conquest over our passions to be a virtue. They neglect wedlock," right? They don't get married, "but choose out other persons' children while they are pliable and fit for learning, and esteem them to be of their kindred, and form them according to their own manners." So other people's children end up coming to their community and they raise them. Luke, your computer's doing this again. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so it's really interesting. We read Josephus. There are other ancient writers such as Pliny who writes about the Essenes. Pliny tells us that they live on the west bank of the Dead Sea, which happens to be right where we find that site, right on the west bank of the Dead Sea. Are you? I'll do the slide. Okay. All right. So if we look here, we see a lot of different things in their in the ruins that fit with the documents. So in the documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we read about a community that has a communal life. They all live together, almost like. Have you ever heard of this before? People living according to a kind of rule, and they are celibate, and they sound familiar? All right, it sounds like religious communities, right? And so one of the first people who found the site and really excavated this was Roland DeVoe, who was a Catholic priest, right? And he actually describes this as a monastery, and the document that regulates their life, the scholars now call the community rule, which is, of course, what people like Benedictines follow, a rule. There are some really interesting analogs. So they live a communal life. There's actually a probationary period. So you just can't join the community and be a full member. You have to wait a few years before you gain full membership. Celibacy, very important. That fits with the ruins here as well. There are no female skeletons dating back to the 1st century at the cemetery that's there. They also practice sacred meals, and there also seems to be a place here like a refectory where they would have eaten. They have a very distinctive theology. They believe in predestination. They also believe in immortality, that that the righteous will live forever. They believe in the resurrection of the dead. And because the Dead Sea Scrolls have so many similarities with what we otherwise know of the Essenes, and because the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit a theology that is in conflict in some ways with the Sadducees. Sadducees don't believe in resurrection or in angels, but the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about this. Also, the Dead Sea Scrolls are in conflict with some of the Pharisees' beliefs. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, condemn marrying your niece, which was a practice of the Pharisees. You could marry your niece if you were a Pharisee, right? So many scholars today think that the Dead Sea Scrolls are best attributed to this Essene group, all right? This first century group of Christians. Now, the Essenes, it's kind of interesting why the New Testament never mentions them, right? Maybe the New Testament didn't want to make a scene. Sorry, that was bad. Sorry. Is Mary here? She's groaning. She absolutely hates my puns. Every time I pun, there's like daggers coming out of her eyes. All right. Okay, so I've given you a little sheet here where you can see all the different practices: celibacy, poverty, repentance, predestination. All these things I've taken from various scholars. You see this little chart here laying all of this out. It seems to fit well with what we know about the Essene community. So, having said all of that, what does the Dead Sea Scrolls do for our understanding of early Christianity? Well, look at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. In the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, we read about John the Baptist, how John the Baptist was out in the wilderness, and he had a very memorable message, right? Here's what we read. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, who shall prepare thy way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. All right, so you read in the New Testament about John the Baptist. He's in the wilderness. He's saying things like, prepare the way of the Lord, quoting from Isaiah. Well, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, guess what they read? This is one of the documents. It says, when such men as these come to be in Israel, the wicked, the righteous, and they're conforming to the right doctrines, what will the righteous do? They will separate from the session of perverse men and go to the wilderness. There, why? To prepare the way of truth. As it is written, quote, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. That's exactly what John the Baptist is associated with. Not just being in the wilderness, but actually there are a lot of other parallels between John the Baptist and the Essene community. I already told you that they practice ritual washing. What is John the Baptist doing out in the wilderness? He's baptizing, right? And so some scholars have suggested that there might be a connection between John the Baptist and the Essenes. Now, there are all kinds of sensationalistic books that say, oh yeah, this is it, we've proven it. We know that John the Baptist was really an Essene, or John the Baptist was there in the Dead Sea Scrolls community. Okay, that's pushing it too far. We don't know for sure that. But it is interesting that Josephus says that the Essene community would raise other people's children. And one thing some people have pointed out is when John the Baptist is born, his parents are really old. So who raised John the Baptist? Where did John the Baptist get this idea of being out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord? Some people have suggested that there might be a connection between John the Baptist and the Dead Sea community. But again, it got to be clear, we don't know that for sure. Now, another thing that we see, of course, in John the Baptist is he's a celibate out in the wilderness. We also know Jesus practiced celibacy. We also know Paul the Apostle practiced celibacy. Yet some people in our culture find that very hard to believe. Oh, celibacy, that's nonsense. And so they'll fall for all kinds of sensationalistic, again, conspiracy theories. How many of you have ever heard of a book called The Da Vinci Code? Any of you ever hear that book? All right, go ahead and hit the slide there. Dan Brown famously wrote this book, The Da Vinci Code, and in his book, he writes, Jewish men all married. So Jesus was married. No, they didn't all marry, right? One of the things we know is that the Essenes did not marry, right? And that actually makes sense of a lot of what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in particular in the community there in the ruins and those ruins that I mentioned earlier. Something else we might look at: Jesus' messianic identity. Some scholars have been very skeptical about whether or not Jesus actually identified himself as the Messiah. And I don't have time to get into a long argument about this, but in the past, people are getting into a long discussion of it, and I'm going to sadly oversimplify things here a bit, but a lot more would need to be said. But let me just highlight this. Recently, scholars have begun to acknowledge that if you're going to do history and you're going to talk about what the historical Jesus must have been like, then whatever you say about him, you've got to affirm that Jesus at least was a Jew. That makes sense, right? Jesus was a Jew. And so in the past, scholars would be very skeptical about various elements of the Gospels. But as, for example, this book, Christian Beginnings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other books, the one I mentioned, the series by Charles Worth, what many scholars are showing is that a lot of the things that we see in the Gospels actually are very Jewish and are especially reinforced by what we read in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, for example, the idea that John the Baptist would be in the wilderness saying, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Some people say, well, we don't really know if that could be reliable. You know, very skeptical people would maybe call that into question. And that's understandable. I mean, there are a lot of documents in the ancient world that are not reliable. Of course, for a person of faith, we believe as Catholics that the Bible is inspired. So by faith, we have that confidence in Scripture. But historians, maybe who don't have faith, and of course as Catholics we recognize faith is a gift, many historians will want a little bit more evidence. How can we believe that these Gospels are historically reliable? Well, when we situate them in the first century, there are some remarkable points of contact between John the Baptist, but also Jesus and the Dead Sea community, for example. So Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann is a famous New Testament scholar. And Rudolf Bultmann, okay, you got to go up. You've gone too far. One more up. Oh, I didn't put the quote on there. Oh, okay, never mind. All right, Rudolf Bultmann says, Jesus did not believe himself to be the Messiah. Bultmann did not believe that the Gospel's portrait of Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus doing things, Jesus teaching in such a way that depicts him as the Messiah, that was historical. He believed that it was only after the Easter experience of the early Christians, as he might put it, that they came to think of Jesus as the Messiah. So what about all these passages in the Gospels where, Jesus is depicted as the Messiah? Well, people will say, well, that was just made up later by the early Christians. The early Christians wanted to make Jesus into the Messiah. So all those passages that you read about in the New Testament, where such skeptics would say, all those passages, well, that's just the result of Christian reflection. Okay? Doesn't really fit with what we know about Judaism, some people might say. All right, next slide. So I'll give you an example. In Matthew 11, we read about John the Baptist in prison. And he hears about these miraculous deeds that Jesus is performing. And he sends word by his disciples. And he says to Jesus through them, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus said to the disciples of John, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. Lepers are cleansed. And the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up. And the poor have good news preached to them." Now, when Jesus is doing this, when Jesus is saying these things, his hearers would have known he was quoting from the book of Isaiah. Jesus saying, go back, tell John, you see all these things happening, the lepers being cleansed, for example, but other things such as the blind receiving their sight, the lame walking, the deaf hearing, right? They're hearing the good news preached to them. Jesus here is evoking two passages from Isaiah, and he's actually putting them together. It's really interesting. One of them is in Isaiah 35, talking about the future day. God restores his people. And it says, then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing for joy. All right? And another place in Isaiah 61, we read, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. What do you call an anointed one? The Messiah, right? Anointed one means Messiah. So it seems in the first century, people were reading this as a text about the Messiah, right? He's anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound. So Jesus is drawing from both of these two passages, all right? Now, Jesus quoting from Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61 and Matthew 11. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found something remarkable. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a document, 4Q521, also referred to as the Messianic Apocalypse. Right? And in this document, it describes the coming of the Messiah. So here we have a text written by ancient Jews who are trying to envision what the Messiah will do. And they're writing it out. It's almost like, what is the job description for a Messiah? What is the Messiah going to do? Check this out. For the heavens and the earth shall listen to his Messiah. For he will honor the pious upon the throne of his eternal kingdom. Release the captives. Open the eyes of the blind. Lifting up those who are oppressed. By the way, the reason there are brackets around some of these is because that's where in the Dead Sea Scrolls there were holes. Scholars have to figure out what was there. And the Lord shall do glorious things which have not been done, for he shall heal the critically wounded. He shall raise the dead. He shall bring good news to the poor. He shall lead the holy ones, and the hungry he shall enrich. Sounds familiar? What did this passage just do? It brought together Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61, which just happens to be the same thing Matthew 11 says Jesus did. What are the odds of that? Right? In other words, a lot of scholars have pointed to this passage in Matthew 11 and said, you can't tell me that this doesn't reflect first century Judaism. You can't say, oh, well, this is just a story that was invented by the Christians. That's hard to swallow. Now, there might be other arguments, other reasons people might think of that, but one good reason for thinking that that story may not just be totally made up out of whole cloth, right, is that when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see that this is exactly what first century Jews were expecting. It makes sense that Jesus would talk in this way. Does this make sense to everybody? Y'all following this? Okay. So we actually have a document you can touch with your hands that goes all the way back to Jesus' day. This was sitting on a shelf somewhere while Jesus was walking along the streets of Galilee. Right? Fascinating. Okay, next slide. Another thing we read about in the Gospels is Jesus announcing that he has come to, what's going on here, Luke? You've got more computer problems here. It's flashing in some weird way. Don't know what that's doing. Okay, well, you're working on that. We'll talk about this. In the Gospel of Mark and also in the Gospel of Matthew, this is on a handout if you have the handout. In Mark 10:45, we have a famous saying of Jesus. Scholars call it the ransom saying. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man also came not to serve, but not to be served, rather, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, here in this passage, it seems obvious that Jesus is identifying his death with atoning significance. His death is going to be offered as a kind of sacrificial offering in atonement for sins. Right? Here we have the idea that Jesus' death has redemptive value. All right. Now, many scholars are skeptical that Jesus would have seen his death in that way. Scholars will say, well, the Christians, just after Jesus died, they made it up, that, Jesus saw his death in this way. Why? Well, because that's a very Christian idea, right? That Jesus died on behalf of sins. That's a very Christian idea. Okay, that's true. But just because it's a Christian idea doesn't mean that the Christians couldn't have got it from Jesus, right? So just because something sounds Christian doesn't mean that it's necessarily, it doesn't have an historical anchor in Jesus' ministry. And so many scholars are skeptical. Gerd Ludemann has this book, Jesus After 2,000 Years. And he quotes this story where Jesus says this, and he says, all the details of this story, they're to be derived from the later community. They were all made up by the early Christians. Jesus never really said this. Why? Well, this idea that Jesus would die for sins, that Jesus' death would be redemptive, that's Christian theology. Really? Well, one of the things we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is something remarkable. In a document called the Damascus Document, we read this. And this is the rule of the assembly of the camps. Those who walk in them, in the time of wickedness, until there arises the Messiah of Aaron and Israel. Now, it's a fascinating passage, and scholars have debated this. Does this mean that the Dead Sea community was awaiting two Messiahs? One from the Levitical line and one from David's line? Or is it just one Messiah? There's a lot of debate about this. But is it possible that that this community was expecting two figures? One from the Levitical line and one from the line of David. By the way, in the New Testament, what do you have? Two major figures. One from the Levitical line, named John the Baptist, and one from David's line, Jesus. Rather interesting. But notice here, it says that when Messiah or Messiahs come, right, what will happen? And this is the exact interpretation of the regulations by which they shall be ruled until there arises the Messiah of Aaron and Israel, and he, that seems to indicate that they only expect one Messiah, and he will atone for their iniquity. Seems like a priestly Messiah. A Messiah who's going to offer a priestly sacrifice. And his sacrifice is going to atone for sins. Okay, but in the Gospels, Jesus' sacrifice is supposed to be himself. Are you really expecting me to believe that a first century Jew could talk that way? That's how Christians talk. That your suffering could be atoning. That's Christian language. Your suffering can be redeeming, redemptive. Actually, it fits quite well with the Dead Sea community. In another one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we read, in the community council there shall be 12 men and 3 priests, perfect in everything that has been revealed, from all the law to implement truth, justice, and the American way. No, that's not what it says. To implement truth, justice, judgment, compassionate love, and unassuming behavior of one to another. To preserve faithfulness in the land with firm purpose and repentant spirit in order to atone for sin. How are they going to atone for sin? Well, by offering sacrifices in the temple, right? That's what Jews do. Well, not here. They will atone for sin by doing justice. And look at this. And undergoing trials. So the suffering of the righteous is going to, in some way, atone for sin. Right? So, a good friend of mine, actually some of you are familiar with his work, Brant Petrie, wrote a great book. It's actually his doctoral dissertation. And in his doctoral dissertation, he makes a tremendously, I think, persuasive argument that Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, that his suffering will have atoning value. There are various passages that seem to suggest this. This idea that suffering has redemptive value. This fits quite well with what we see in first century Judaism and texts such as, there are many other texts you could look at, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. something else we might talk about. A new covenant meal. Paul talks about this, for example. In the New Testament, there's a new covenant meal. Right? He explains this in 1 Corinthians 11. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way also, after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." All right. Now, I've got a book coming out on Paul that is being published by Erdman's, and I'm co-writing it with Brant Petrie and John Kincaid, who you've heard of. And I wrote a chapter on this passage. There's so much I'd love to say here, but let me just, for our purposes here, point out this language of new covenant that Paul uses. Right? Sounds very familiar to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once again, go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, actually, before I get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, let me point out a passage from Josephus. Josephus is that first century Jewish historian I mentioned earlier. And in fact, Josephus tells us that the Dead Sea community, the Essenes, put a lot of emphasis on their sacred meals. Sacred meals were very important to the Dead Sea community. Then what were they doing? They were trying to live according to the hope of the prophets for the restoration of Israel. Josephus says this: "When they again assemble in one place, and after girding their loins with linen clothes, bathe their bodies in cold water, after this purification," so you're purified through water, "they assemble in a private apartment, which none of the uninitiated is permitted to enter." This is also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The meal is only for those who are fully part of the community. Pure now themselves, they repair to the refectory. What is a refectory? Where they eat. But notice what it says. They repair to the refectory as to some sacred temple. Their meal is like eating in a sanctuary. When they have taken their seats in silence, the baker serves out the loaves to them in order, and the cook sets before each one plate with a single course. Before meat, the priest says a grace, and none partake until after the prayer. The meals were very important. And it seems likely, go ahead, it seems likely that this meal was associated with the future hopes, the eschatological hopes, the hopes for the restoration of Israel at Qumran. And these hopes that they had for what the Messiah would do, what would happen in the future age, were closely associated with the concept of, guess what? The new covenant. In the Damascus document, we read, "All the men who entered the new covenant in the land of Damascus." The righteous are those who belong to a new covenant. In the community rule, we read, "All who enter the community's rule shall be initiated into the covenant," the new covenant before God. And so they come together and they eat this meal. And what we actually discover in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the same document, in the community rule, is that they eat this meal, they celebrate this meal. Why? Well, if you look at the community rule carefully, it seems to be an anticipation of a great meal that they will celebrate when the Messiah comes. They think that when the Messiah comes, there's going to be this future banquet. Go ahead and go to it. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Well, boy, did I miss this? I feel like I missed a couple of passages. Did I skip something there? Well, let's just go to this passage. "The session of the men of renown, invited to the feast for the council of the community, when at the end of days the Messiah shall assemble with them. The Messiah of Israel shall enter, and the heads of the thousands of Israel shall sit before him, each according to his importance, according to his station and their encampments and their journeys, when they meet at the communal table to set out bread and wine, and the communal table is arranged to eat and to drink wine, no one shall extend his hand over the bread and the wine before the priest. For he shall first bless the portion. Doesn't sound just like their regular meals, right? This sounds like their regular meals that they eat, the new covenant meals that they eat, so to speak, right? Their meals are in anticipation of the meal of the Messiah. Afterwards, the Messiah of Israel shall extend his hands to the bread. Afterwards, all the congregation of the community shall bless, each according to his importance. They shall act according to this statute whenever the meal is arranged, when as many as 10 meet together. So, what do we read about in the New Testament? In the New Testament, what do the Christians have? Well, they have a new covenant meal that they celebrate now that the Messiah has come. We call it the Eucharist in Catholic tradition, right? And in fact, St. Paul also tells us something interesting. Not just anyone could eat of the communal meal in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You had to be a full member of the community. You had to be purified in the water, the purification waters. You had to have been through the probationary period and all the rest. Likewise, in 1 Corinthians, Paul seems to suggest that receiving the Eucharist is no minor thing. He says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body of the Lord. Let a man examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment upon himself." And he goes on to talk about this. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how if you're not faithful, if you are guilty of some incredible moral problem, like having relations that are incestuous, that happens at Corinth. Some of the people he's writing to are involved in illicit relationships. What does Paul command? Well, he actually commands that that person be excommunicated, kicked out of the community, which is what it seems would have also happened at Qumran, right? So lots more could be said, but why don't we fast forward here. Okay, something else to highlight, okay? In the Gospels, Jesus speaks of the Messiah, right? And what does he say about the Messiah? There's actually only one passage where he actually gives us a sort of insight into who the Messiah is. Fascinating passage in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus taught in the temple. He said, "How can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, declared, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put thy enemies under thy feet.' David himself calls him Lord. So how is he his son?" And the great throng heard him gladly. Now there's lots of debate about various aspects of this passage. I can't get into it all. Timothy Gray has a great book, The Temple and the Gospel of Mark, where he really unpacks these few verses, and I think expertly so. But here is a passage where Jesus is talking about the Messiah, and he's talking about the Messiah, and he quotes from a passage in the Old Testament, Psalm 110. Psalm 110 says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord is sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In Psalm 110, we read about the Messiah. Jesus associates Psalm 110 with the Messiah. And in fact, that passage links the Messiah with a figure in the Old Testament who was priest king of Jerusalem named Melchizedek. Okay? All right, now, next passage. Something else Jesus says in the Gospels, sort of interesting about himself. This is in the Gospel of John. There are all kinds of historical issues with the Gospel of John, but let's just take a look at this passage in John without getting into a lot of different issues. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." What is Jesus saying when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am"? What is he doing here? Philip?
It's referring to the Hebrew name for God.
He's referring to the Hebrew name for God, right? Seems that Jesus is identifying himself as God. Later on, Thomas will fall at Jesus' feet and say, "My Lord and my God." The beginning of the gospel, Jesus is identified as the Word. The Word was God. Right? And Jesus says here, before Abraham was, I am. And the Jews get it. They say, it says they took up stones to throw at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Jesus is identified as God here in this passage. Stunning passage. Is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls that might relate to these passages? Of course, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is the Messiah. The Messiah is identified as God. In the other passage we looked at in Mark, Jesus identifies the Messiah with Psalm 110 and that figure Melchizedek. Well, there's a really interesting passage found in the 11th cave at Qumran. That's the site, right, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they call this fragment 11Q, 11th cave at Qumran Q. That's how all the scrolls are sort of categorized. They call it 11Q Melchizedek. And in this passage, we read about the coming future Redeemer, the one who will come at the end of history to save God's people. And guess what that figure is called? Melchizedek. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus identifies the Messiah with Psalm 110, which also identifies that figure with Melchizedek. We read, indeed, it is the time of the year of grace of Melchizedek. And he will, by his strength, raise up the holy ones of God to execute judgment, as it has been written concerning him in the songs of David, as it says, God stands in the assembly. Notice, saying that of this figure who's going to come, his name is Melchizedek, it says about him, God. In other words, it's saying that Melchizedek can be called God. This future coming guy who's going to save Israel is God. What is this passage in Psalm 82 about? We read, its interpretation concerns Belial, that's Satan, and the spirits of his lot. And Melchizedek will exact the vengeance of the judgments of God. So there's going to be this future figure who's going to come named Melchizedek, and he's God. And he's going to be the final deliverer. Is this a Messiah figure? Scholars debate it. But even though the word isn't there, there's good reason, I think, to believe this is describing a messianic figure, the one who will come to save Israel. And here in this passage, he's not only identified with God, he's identified with Melchizedek. This fits really nicely with the kinds of things we see in the Gospels, right? By the way, notice what Satan is called, Belial. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says, what accord is Christ with Belial? So there's overlap with the New Testament, all these different places. At the very least, what can we say? The New Testament is really coming out of this first century Jewish milieu. Just a couple other points, and then we'll end. Okay? The overseer. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is over the community a supervisor. The supervisor or the leader of the community is called the overseer. So we read, during the session of the general membership, no man in their Dead Sea community, in this new covenant community, no man should say anything except by the permission of the general membership, or more particularly of the man who is the overseer. Mebeker is the Hebrew, but overseer is the way you can translate that. The overseer of the General Assembly. Now, in Greek, if you wanted to translate overseer, how would you do that? Well, the word for over, or on top of, is epi. Think of the top layer of your skin. What's it called? Epidermis, right? So epi. And the word for seen, it's an English word for which we derived the word scope. Like microscope, right? And so in Greek, the word is episkopos. The word for the overseer of a community would be episkopos. Anybody know why that word is interesting? Episkopos. Well, eventually it comes to us through, I think, the German. But episkopos is where we get the word bishop. In fact, everywhere in the New Testament where you have the word episkopos, it's translated bishop. Let me show you an example of this. In 1 Timothy, we read, "The saying is sure, if anyone aspires to the office of bishop, episkopos, he desires a noble task." The word for the leader of the community in the New Testament is overseer, bishop. Okay? So here you have a bunch of Jews in the first century, and they're imagining what it will be like when the Messiah comes. What is he going to be like? Well, they'll be preparing the way in the wilderness for him. He is going to be someone who atones for sin. He's going to establish a new covenant community. That community is going to suffer, and their sufferings, their tribulations, will atone for sin. Messiah and their community. They will celebrate together a meal with bread and wine. And that community will be led by an overseer. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Right? You can see how, like from a Catholic perspective, we might say, wow, these ancient Jews studying these texts were envisioning what we end up having in the new covenant in Christ and in the church we belong to. The earliest Christians were part of this line of continuity of hopes. And so much of what we have as Catholics develops along this line. By the way, in the early church, there's a quote from Ignatius of Antioch. Remember what it said in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? During the session of the General Assembly, no man should say anything except by the permission of the general membership, more particularly the one who is the overseer. Well, Ignatius of Antioch says, it is essential, therefore, that you continue your current practice and do nothing without the episkopos, the overseer. Do nothing without the bishop. But be subject also to the presbytery, the elders, as to the apostles of Jesus Christ. And it goes on to talk about the deacons as well. So in the early church we have, now we're running out of time, we're just about to end. I could go on and on and on. Seriously, I could do an entire course for 10 weeks just on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and at the end of it, you would feel like we've just scratched the surface. So much interesting work has been done. For example, how many messiahs? Are there developments in the Dead Sea Scrolls? I mean, maybe over time they came to different ideas at different times. So much could be said about this community. So many other things we could point out that are overlaps between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. Let's just do kind of a rapid fire succession here of things, okay? Kind of a, what do they call it? What do they call it? Like a lightning round. Thank you. Lightning round. There you go. Lightning round. Okay. I don't know why I was thinking pistols. That's violent. Okay. My son was excited. He thought I was talking about blasters. Okay. This is the first time any of my children have ever heard me give a talk before. I'm really happy Michael came tonight. Okay. He's going to miss me because I'm leaving. I've been gone every night this week, and I'm leaving for a trip tomorrow morning, and I won't be back. He won't see me till Monday, so he wanted to hang out with his daddy. So this is great. I'm really glad he's here. Okay. So many other things we could say about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the works of law. What are the works of law? Well, they're various ceremonial practices that are associated with the Torah. Paul explains in the New Testament that you're saved by faith apart from works of law. Some people want to say that that meant that Paul taught that you're saved by faith and not by good works. But if you actually read the Dead Sea Scrolls, in particular 4Q MMT, you'll see that works of law are not good works necessarily, but talking about ceremonial practices. Although it is true, Paul believes that you're saved first by grace and not by any good thing that you do. That's important to underscore. The initial gift of justification for Paul is not the result of any good work that you do. However, after you receive that gift of justification, it seems Paul thinks that final justification will be by works in some way. Anyway, I have a whole chapter in a book called The Role of Works at the Final Judgment. 4 views on the role of works at the final judgment. I co-wrote with James Dunn and some other scholars, if you want to go into that. But works of law, it's a term we find in the New Testament. There are Beatitudes. You know the Beatitudes in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, in 4Q525, there are some Beatitudes. And actually, some scholars suggest, Pesch, for example, in an article written in French, that I'm sure you're all going to go out and read immediately now, he sees some similarities between the Beatitudes in the Gospels and this text. In Galatians, Paul talks about Jesus' crucifixion as Jesus being hanged on a tree. That's kind of a weird way to put it. Not if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, in 4Q169, hanging on a tree is a way of describing crucifixion. One of my favorite parallels is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community, right, this new covenant community, they all believe they're awaiting the coming of the Messiah. They're already celebrating the new covenant before it dawns. Right? This community describes itself as a temple. Well, that sounds like what Paul says in the New Testament, where he explains that the church is a temple. In the book of Revelation, we read about things like the battle of Gog and Magog. Sounds a lot like what we read about in the War Scroll. There's also in the New Testament the idea of a heavenly Jerusalem or a new Jerusalem. We see that in, for example, Revelation 21 or in Galatians. See the same idea in various Dead Sea Scrolls, right? This is 1Q32, so this is the first cave at Qumran, the 32nd classified fragment. That's how they do this, right? So these are all individual fragments that refer to the New Jerusalem. Also the idea of Israel and all of the Jews being restored. I don't have time to develop this more. Excommunication from the community, I already mentioned that. That happens in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 5. Also happens in the community rule in 2:16. Role of the overseer, I already mentioned that. Celibacy, mentioned that. In the New Testament, the righteous are called sons of light or darkness. That idea is also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me close with one last parallel. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Now, I've written a lot on this passage. I have an article in Journal of Biblical Literature where I unpack it a bit more. One of the interesting things is the way that this passage parallels passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, for example, in one document, we read, Belial, remember the name for Satan, is the counselor of the wicked's heart. Schemes of wickedness, they wallow in guilt. I have become like a sailor in a ship in the ravaging seas. Their waves and all their breakers war over me. A whirlwind without a lull for taking breath, without a track to take a straight path over the surface of the water. The deep thunders at my side. My soul nears the gates of death. Remember what Jesus says? The gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. I've become like someone who enters a fortified city and finds shelter on the high wall until salvation. My God, I lean on your truth, for you place the foundation upon rock. So how am I going to avoid the gates of death? I'll be on a rock. And beams to the correct size, and at true plumb line to stretch out tested stones to build a fortress which will not shake. Now, what is being described here is the gates of death, and you have this foundation rock that you'll be safe on. One of the things that's interesting, as scholars have pointed out, is this passage seems to link to others where the community is described as a temple. But another word that's used is kahal. The community is described as the kahal. These are the men of renown those summoned to the assembly, kahal, those gathered for the community council in Israel. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, you have the word kahal. It's the word that's sometimes used for the assembly, the congregation. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the term that's used for the New Covenant community. Now, when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the word that they used to translate kahal is ekklesia, church. Kahal is the Hebrew word for church. So what do they call the New Covenant community? Essentially, the church. It's the same word that the New Testament uses. It's a Greek word, the Greek equivalent. And what is this New Covenant community going to look like? In the community council, there shall be 12 men and 3 priests, perfect in everything that has been revealed from all, and the law to implement truth, justice, and the American way. No, truth, justice, judgment, compassionate love, and unassuming behavior of one to another, to preserve faithfulness in the land with firm purpose and repentant spirit in order, we already read this, to atone for sin by doing justice and undergoing trials. Through their suffering they will have atonement, to walk with everyone in the measure of the truth and the regulation of the time. When these things exist in Israel, the community council shall be founded on truth, to an everlasting plantation, a holy house for Israel, the foundation of the Holy of Holies. So the community is identified with a temple. And if you keep reading, the leaders of the community are linked to the foundation of this community. So if the community is a temple, the leaders are the foundation. What do you read about in Matthew 16? There's a new covenant community. What's it called? Church. And who is the foundation of it? The leader, who's one of the 12. You following all this? Okay. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Okay. And in Matthew 16, I don't have time to unpack all this. You can read my Journal of Biblical Literature article. But in there, I point out that when Jesus says, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church," the language is actually temple language. Because Peter says, "You are the Son of the living God." Jesus says, "I will build this." Whenever you have that language of Son of God and Anointed One, Messiah, and building in the Old Testament, it's about the Son of God in the Old Testament, David, who's anointed, who builds something. What does he build? What did the son of David build? Solomon. He built something famous. The temple. All right? Solomon built a temple. Jesus is the true son of David. He's building the true temple, which is, well, in John, it's his body, but more broadly in the New Testament, it's the church. And I think that idea of the church as temple is here in Matthew 16. So, I could go on to read the whole thing, but it goes on to say at the end of this quote that I have here, "When these have been established in the foundation of the community." Okay, so anyway, George Beasley Murray, famous Protestant scholar, wrote a book, Jesus and the Kingdom. And he writes about this passage. In this passage, 12 men and 3 priests constitute the foundation of the community. This is not to suggest that Matthew 16:18 is in any way dependent on the Qumran passage. It's not like they said, what did they say, Qumran? Oh, we better say that. It's not exactly what they say, Qumran. But it does show, however, that the ideas in the former passage were abroad in Judaism during the time of Jesus and the earliest church. So what does Jesus do? He comes and he establishes the new temple, the kahal, which is what many Jews were expecting him to do. At least, I don't want to say many, because we don't know how many, but at least some Jews. Those who, it seems, were, not him in particular either, they didn't know if it would be Jesus. They were expecting the Messiah to come, expecting a new covenant. So much overlap with the New Testament. Is this interesting to you? Okay. So you could study this your whole life and just unpack more and more. And there are lots of nuances here and lots of debates and all kinds of things that unfortunately I don't have time to get into. But I don't think there are a lot of Catholic undergraduates who know how exciting it can be to study the New Testament in its original context and appreciate the historical origins of their faith, see how it goes all the way back into ancient Judaism, and then from the perspective of faith, affirm that Jesus is bringing fulfillment to those things that were expected, at least by some Jews, based on the word of the prophets. As we say in the Creed, he rose, all these things, in accordance with the Scriptures. Fantastic.